on the top of Memches Amud Aleph. Omar Rava, my time of Rav Shimon ben Elazar, who holds that the Eved at the time of his shichur does not need to be mekabel ol mitzvahs, and we could be makbil him into the mikvah, be megayer him, and meshachrim bal korcho. D'chsiv pasuk in Parshas Bo in the context of Korban Pesach, kol Eved ish miknas kesef umalta oso oz yochal bo. Now we know that if you own an Eved and he's an orel and he needs Mila, and you have not been mal your Eved, then you cannot eat from the Korban Pesach. The Torah says umalto, so that means every Adon is obligated to be mal his Eved, and only then, after the Mila, is he allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. And the question that is posed here is Eved Ish. What does that mean, Eved Ish? Why does the Torah specify Ish below Eved Isha? Doesn't the same halach apply to an Eved Isha? Let's say a woman wants to eat from the Korban Pesach. So we're not going to be ma'akiv her because she's excluded under the word Ish. And even though she was not diligent in seeing to it that her Eved would be mal, would be mohul, that doesn't make any sense. Ella, we have to find a different interpretation of Eved Ish. Eved Ish, atamol bal korch, it says, umalta oso. And the lashon of umalta oso implies even bal korcho. Atamal bal korcho and Eved Ish, what does that mean? Iatomal ben ish bal korcho. We're contrasting a father vis-a-vis his son's milah and an adon vis-a-vis his eved's milah. In the case of a ben ish, which means the son of the father, there's no bal korcho. He does not have the ability to force his son to milah. If the son is a gadol, then the Torah says that he molachem kol zachar, but not in the pasuk of Eved Ish, which is malo so bal korcho. If you're the owner of an Eved, you could be mal the Eved against his will. And in the case of an Adon who has a son who's a gadol, he's past bar mitzvah age, then you cannot be malim against his will. So in the parsha of Himolachem Kol Zachar, Himolach Kol Zachar, it doesn't say Kol Ish. And the word Ish here is only written in the case of an Eved, as it says Eved Ish. For Rabbanon hold that Ein Makbilin Avodah Bal Korchon B'Shas Shichur. Omar Ula, what's the reason for the Rabbanon? Kishev She'iyat Amol Ben Ish Bal Korcho. You cannot be mal your son once he reaches gadlus against his will. Kach Iyat Amol Eved Ish Bal Korcho. So too the Adon does not have the right to be mal his Eved Bal Korcho. So the Gemara says, Velo Ksiv Kol Eved Ish. Why did the Torah add the word Ish? According to the Chachamim, Bishleim Rav Shimon, we had a drush of Ish to exclude a case of Ben Ish. So it's Eved Ish and not Ben Ish. But according to the Chachamim, since the law of Eved Ish is the same identical law as Eved as Ben Ish, so why did the Torah mention Ish at all? And the Gemara says, who that separate, extra, redundant Ish mi boile, I need it with Shmuel for the halach of Shmuel. The Amar Shmuel hamafkir avdo, if a person sets his Eved hefker, he removes his kinyan mama, is Yotzel Lecherus. What does that mean, Yotzel Lecherus? That he has a din of a ben chorin without needing a get shichur. The Ein Tzarech get shichur. He can now marry a Jewish girl, and his gerus is complete. So there are two kinyanim in an eved. There's a kinyan moment and a kinyan iser. And Shmuel holds that's the kinyan moment that drags and generates the kinyan iser. If you remove the kinyan moment, then the kinyan iser is paka. Shenemar v'chol eved ish miknas kosev umalto soaz yochel. Every adon is obligated to be mal his avodim, and only after he implements that chiyuv and he circumcises his avodim, only then is he permitted to partake of the Korban Pesach. If he hasn't done so and he didn't mal them, then milas avodov ma'akeves also milechol b'Korban Pesach. And now look how it's difficult. It says Eved Ish, again, v'lo Eved Isha. Is that what Torah means to exclude? That in the case of Eved Ish, his avodim who are not gemalt, but if it's an Isha, then her avodim without me, they're not ma'akiv for eating Pesach. That doesn't make sense. No, there's no logical distinction here between Eved Ish and Eved Isha. So why did the Torah say Ish? Ella Eved sheyesh lo reshus rabo olav kari Eved. The Adon has the schus to be meshabed the Eved. He's kani lo b'kinyan mammon. Then he's called it Eved, and he has a kinyan Easter as well, which means that he's not allowed to marry a Jewish girl. And the only way of being mafkia that kinyan Isur is through a get shichur. And that's the case of an Evet sheyesh lo reshus l'rabo olav. He has the Adon as the kinyan mammon, hence as a kinyan Isur. But she'ein reshus l'rabo olav, if let's say the Adon once had kinyani mamon in the Evet Schusish Tamshus Evet Schusish Shibud Lishtabidbo. But now the Rav has given up and forfeited his Schus Kinyan Mamon, his Ein Kori Evet, meaning even the Kinyan Iser is Paka, and there's no need for get Shichut Mafkia. Once the Kinyan Mama was gone, and therefore he's allowed to marry Bas Yisrael even without receiving a get shikhr from his Rav. Maskif Rav Papa. Now we go back to Rav Sheshes. On the previous Omud, Rav Sheshes said that there's machlokes between Rav Shimon ben Elazar and the Rabbanan, not only in the din of Yefas Toar, whether you can be matbil the Yefas Torah Bal Korch against her will, but also with regard to a person who buys an Eved from Yisrael. Does he require, is it a requirement that the Eved be makabel al atzmo ol mitzvahs at the time of Shichur, or does the Adon have the rights and the authority to be matbil the Eved Bal Korch? The Gemara argues against Rav Sheshes, this Rav Papa's argument, Amor the Shamet Lulu Rabbanon. When did the Rabbanon say that there's no license to be matbil the Eved Bal Korch, and the Eved must accept upon himself all mitzvahs at time of the Shichur? That's only the Yefas Toar. There you require Kabbalah Atzma. Why do lo shaycha b'mitzvahs? Because immediately after the matbila, he was matbila for the purpose of shvachos. He was matbil her for shichror, and as long as she was a shivcha under his dominion, she was not no heges b'mitzvahs, and therefore the Rabbanan hold Ein matbilin also bal karcha. She has to now accept mitzvahs on her own at the time of the shikhr. Aval eved shayach b'mitzvahs. The eved has been serving his adon, his Jewish adon, for a number of days, and he was knowing mitzvahs as they are nogos be eved the avodim. So he already has a shaychus to mitzvahs. Achinami afilu rabbanon modu, even rabbanon who hold an ifas Torah, we need her kabbalah, and we cannot be matbil her against her will. Here, the moda in the case of an eved, there's no need for the eved to be makabel all mitzvahs might be also about karcho, because he was already knowing the mitzvahs. And the Keren Ora points out that in order for this Eved to become a Yisrael, he has to be makabel on himself all mitzvahs at least one time. So the Eved, when he was knowing the mitzvahs, even if the Adon was matbila li avdus bal karcha, nevertheless, by virtue of his being knowing mitzvahs mirtzono for kama yomim, ze atzmo hu kabbalah. Alkein yochel shachar also afilu bal karcha. But again, there's no parallel in Yifas Torah because she's not no heges b'mitzvahs at all. He's coming to be Meshachar immediately after he took her as a shivcha. Tanya, we learned in the Brayse Echad Ger, v'Echad Lokeach Eved Mina Akum. And after he was Kona the Akum, he was Meshachar the Eved. Sorech Lekabel. The Eved has to be Mekabel Atzmo mitzvahs. And that's a case where the Jew bought the Eved from a guy. By implication, we should be medayik that Lokeach the Yisrael, if he bought an Eved from another Jew, and the seller, the first Jew, had already been matbil the Eved for Avdus, and the Eved was already knowing the mitzvahs. Again, those mitzvahs lo me'isha. Is ein tzarich lekabel, the Eved does not have to again accept upon himself mitzvahs, all mitzvahs. And Rav Papa interprets this. Mani, to whom do we attribute the authorship of this brayso? That lokech Yisrael ein tzarich lekabel atzmo mitzvahs. If you'll say it's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that's going to be very difficult. Omar, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said the lokech mina akum nami ein tzarich lekabel. In other words, according to the sheet of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, all avodim, any eved, does not require to be mekabel asmol mitzvahs. So how can you tell me that if he bought the eved from a fellow Jew, then and only in that case, since the Eved was knowing the mitzvahs already by the first Adon, the Mocher, therefore there's no need for his Kabbalah soul mitzvahs by the Lokeach. That's only the case where you bought it from a Yisrael. If you bought him from a guy, then the halacha is Tzarech Lekabel. The Eved has to be Mekabel on himself all mitzvahs. And that's against Reb Shimon Elazar, who says that all avodim, even an eved that was purchased from a guy, does not have to accept upon himself all mitzvahs. El by process of elimination Rabbanon, the Bryce must be reflecting the sheet of Rabbanon, Shmami no, then the eved, according to the Chachamim, requires Kabbalah Sol Mitzvahs Me'atzmo. He was never knowing the mitzvahs, but Lokeach Yisrael. He was knowing mitzvahs by the first Yisrael, who now is selling the eved to the second Yisrael. Ain't eved tzarich lekabel atzmo mitzvahs. And that's against Rav Sheshes, who said his claim was that according to the Rabbanon, just like in the case of Yifas Torah, she needs a Kabbalah Atzmobel mitzvahs, B'shas Tvila, so too Alokech Evid Mi Yisrael has to be Makabel on himself all mitzvahs. So the Gemara says, V'ela Kasha, if so, the Rabbanan Amodet Rav Shimon Lazar, that an Eved who is purchased from a Yisrael does not need to be Makabel Atzmol mitzvahs, how will the Rabbanan interpret what we derived from the Brisa mentioned back on Mem Zayin Amid Beis, Echad Ger, the Echad Eved Meshuchrar? Both of them need Kabbalah Sol mitzvahs. And now you just told me that even according to the Rabbanon, in Eved HaNilkach V'Yisrael ain't tzarich l'Kabbalah of mitzvahs. Here we said Echad Ger v'Echad Eved Meshuchrar tzarich l'Kabbalah al atzmo of mitzvahs. Gemara answers Kitanya Hilin Tefillah Tanya. When the Brisa says that an Ger and Eved Meshuchrar are equal, that's as far as Tefillah. An Eved Meshuchrar needs Tefillah at the time of Shichrur in order to become a full-fledged Yisrael, because his Gerus was incomplete when he became an Eved Kanani. And just like a Ger needs Tefillah when he enters into Klal Yisrael, so too an Eved Meshuchrar needs Tefillah like the Ger. But this is not an equation as far as Kabbalah's mitzvahs is concerned. As far as the din of Kabbalah's mitzvahs, even the Rabbanan admit that an Eved Meshuchrar does not need Kabbalah's mitzvahs when you buy the Eved from Yisrael, who kvar noag b'mitzvahs eitzel adon. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in a Brisa. With regard to the parasha of Yifas Toar, Ki Teitze, it says, the Gilchas Roshav Asas Tzipornel, that the Eishes Yifas Toar needs to shave her head and to somehow, again, I'm going to use the ambiguous term because we're going to have machlokes what it means in this context. The asasa litaken is tziporneo, using a deliberately vague word. Is Rabbi Eliezer Omer takus? When the Torah says the asas tziporneo, it means she has to cut off her nails, even though that's not an evil. That doesn't make her disgusting and repulsive. But it's Xeris HaKosev that the Torah requires that she cut off her nails. So everything else in the parsha is geared towards the goal of linavla, to make her disgusting. We're hoping that the Jew, will not marry her. But the exception is tzitzas siparnayim, which the Torah requires, even though it's not menavel her. That's the Xeris HaKos. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Tagdil. Rabbi Akiva insists that we need nivel. And therefore, when it says, the Asa Tzipor means she should grow her nails longer. And that's going to be menavel her. Because usually a woman would cut her nails and not let them disgustingly grow and grow. I don't know if that's true in our society, but Rabbi Eliezer, from whence do I derive the conclusion that the Torah's intention, the also tzipor means that she has to cut her nails? Nemra siya barosh. It says v'gilcha es rosha. So there's a mitzvah of tikkun harosh. And nemra siya b'tzipor nayim. And likewise, the Torah requires some sort of a tikkun in her tzipor nayim, malahal and havara, just like in the case of the rosh. She has to take off her hair, so that's removing hasaras haseir. Afkan avara, with regard to her nails, asiya means to take off her nails. Rabbi Akiva Omer, how do I know from whence do I derive that the meaning of the Torah is that she has to grow her nails long? Nemar asiya barosh, nemar asiya b'tzipor nayim, malahal nivel, afkan nivel. Just like the Torah says with regard to giluach harosh. She has to look detestable, disgusting. But Tiskana Allah is so too here with the Asiyah of Tziparnayim. The goal has to be tisnavel, tisgana olov. Therefore, for sure, the kavana, the intention of the Torah was that she has to grow her nails, because by growing her nails, that's a ma'aser nivul. However, the Gemara says, "Uraya l'divrei Rabbi Eliezer." The psukim seem to indicate that the asiyah of tzipernai means tzitas tzipernai, and this is based on a pasuk in Shmuel Beis. Umefiboshes ben Shol yorad lekras hamelech, and when Mephibosheth comes down to Melech David, and he wants to show David that he's not a mored bo, that he's mishtatef b'tzaro ubi evlo al moves al mos av Sholem beno shel David, is therefore lo katat es siporne raglo v'lo giach es sfamo. Lo asa raglo v'lo katat sipori raglo v'lo asa sfamo lo giach es seir sfamo. The Gemara explains, my asiya, what asiya is there in the safam about which it says asa, v'lo asa sfamo? The answer is havara, to cut down his mustache and remove it. And Mephibosheth did not cut off his mustache; he wanted to show his avelus. So here we see a raya for Rabbi Eliezer that asiya here, as far as vastor ve'asa siparnea, also means havara, like it does in the case of asa sfamo. And she has to cut down her nails. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a brayso, ubachsa es avia v'sima yerech yomi machlokes Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. What does the pasuk mean by avia v'ima?